You're on.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome here. I'm Andrew Zimmerman, and it's my pleasure to be here with you for the next hour or so. For those of you who don't know me, and vice versa, I have been with the college for going on my 34th year. So I've been some time here, and I have enjoyed every minute of it. I teach at the Wilmington campus. I've been there most of my time. I teach economics and social policy, and I work with human services students as well. But I also have some other interests and hobbies and things like that. And one of the things that I wanted to talk with you about today has to do with energy issues as they interface with environmental issues. And I know that at least a few of you, if not many of you, are especially interested in such things, renewable energy in particular, perhaps, electrical energy, and electrical engineering. How many of you are in one of the energy management or solar programs? Let's see. Okay, so there's a cluster of you over there, and others of you are in different things. Okay, I know there's a human services person over there, so that's good. Still good to know about energy issues. Just to let you know, my background in this material and area of things has to do with my graduate work at the University of Delaware in the area of energy and environmental policy. So I have my doctorate in that, and became especially interested in electrical energy and how energy has evolved and changed over the years, the way that we use it, the way that we relate to it. And the word power has not just one meaning, but several, as I hope to convince you of in my presentation today. What I'd like to do is to get started with the formal part of the presentation, because I want to talk with you about what are called energy transitions. In other words, and I'll give you the formal definition of what that means in a moment, but the major changes that occur in not only the fuels and technologies that we use, but in some other things, as it turns out, that really affect a lot of aspects of our way of life, our daily way of life. And that's kind of summed up and captured in the idea of an energy transition. I'm going to speak for about a half hour, and then I want to open it up so that we have the other half hour to just talk about this stuff, because I want to know what your thoughts are on this whole area of energy transitions, and whether, for example, you believe that we are in the process of going through an energy transition to a renewables-based kind of energy system in the future. And how you know that. What are some of the signs, what are some of the evidence that you see and look for that help you to know that? I'm not in the trenches. I don't know the engineering side of these things. I don't keep up with the data, although I do look at it periodically, because when I teach microeconomics, I make sure that my students are familiarized with some of these issues. But so I'm not a really good detail person, but what I am hoping to do is to paint a picture for you of some of the issues that I think are really important. Okay, so here we go. So first thing I want you to do is close your eyes, please, if you don't mind. You don't have to do it for too long. I hope it's not scary. But I want you to do what we call a visioning exercise. Okay? And the vision that I want you to have is what you think our energy future will look like. In other words, the future that we are moving toward when it comes to energy. So for example, do you see in your imagination, in your visioning, do you see lots and lots of buildings all with solar panels on the rooftops everywhere that you turn? That's what I see. Do you see instead vast arrays of very, very large solar panels, much like the one that's in the slides, that might be out in the desert somewhere, or in other very large open areas, so that they're really like giant power plants, in effect, enough to produce the power for a city? Do you see giant wind turbines in large numbers, perhaps hundreds of them in one place that may be on a farm somewhere, or may be covering mountaintops, or out at sea somewhere. Do you hear the whining sound of electric vehicles whizzing by at great speed all around you? And that's pretty much the kind of vehicle that is there. Or do you see coal-powered or coal-fired or natural gas-fired or nuclear power plants generating electricity, and lots of fossil fuel-powered vehicles lumbering around on all the highways and roads? These are alternative energy futures. Notice that some of them are pretty different from what we have today, and one of them is pretty much exactly what we have today. So just wanted to have you, and maybe stay with that image as we go through the other things we're going to go through. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, I wonder how many of us like to think about possibilities that are closer to home, if you will. In other words, they're on a scale that's similar to us. All right, so like rooftop panels, rooftop solar collectors and systems are kind of on a scale closer to us because they could be on our rooftop or somebody else's rooftop. Whereas those very giant, large systems and structures are pretty big, even if they're solar, right? Or if they're wind turbines, which, by the way, as you may know, can be upwards of 300 feet tall, and the blades alone are 100 feet across, and they travel at just incredible speeds. Okay, the question in all these cases is, especially for the ones that are pretty different, is how do we make the transition from where we are today to what any of these possibilities might be? Okay, so just making that change, making that transition. Now, let's maybe take a minute and talk about what a transition is and what it might mean. And I wanted to share with you a quote from someone who I really give a lot of credibility to. His name is Martin Melosi. He wrote a book about energy transitions a number of years ago, and he continues to write about them, think about them, speak about them, and so forth. And since he comes from near here, he was originally in Philadelphia when he started doing this work. He's now across the country somewhere. But anyway, the concept of energy transition is based on the notion of a single energy source or group of sources. So it could be oil, it could be fossil fuels as a group, okay, or whatever it may be. It could be renewables as a group. Dominated the market during a particular period or era, eventually to be challenged and then replaced by another major source or sources. Right? And I want to bring to your attention some interesting words. Dominate. And that's a pretty strong word, to dominate. Another word, to challenge. And I want to suggest to you that when we use words like that, we're talking about more than just equipment or apparatus. We're talking about more than just fuels that we may use to generate or create energy. We're talking about systems. We're talking about institutions that have not only electrical power or other kinds of power, they have political and social power. All right? In other words, they have power to shape our daily lives, and they do, and they have, and they will continue to. All right? So, as Langdon Winter, another one of my favorite sources that I turn to on such things, said, artifacts have politics. Artifacts have politics. So in other words, they have governing power over our daily lives. And that may be a kind of a strange or new way to think of these things, but I just would ask you that, just keep that with you and think about it if you can. So now the thing is, if and when we do have an energy transition next time, and I think we will, the question is, what will it be and what will it be we like, but we will have one because history shows that we've had a number of them across the past. So it's not going to be merely a change or switch of fuels, or a change in the apparatus that is used to make electricity or to power transportation systems or to heat buildings or whatever it may be, right? It's actually going to be a huge rivalry. Maybe this is all over a dramatic battle to the death, but it's going to be pretty nasty, right? It's going to be pretty strong between what might be called the old order or the existing order and whatever the new order, the transition to the new order might be, okay? So we're really talking about rival energy orders. The old order that we're all familiar with because it's been with us and we've been with it for a long time, okay, primarily consists of fossil fuels of various kinds. Not that that's all that it's about, but that's a lot of what it's about, okay? So it's largely about dependence on non-renewable resources. Now, are you all familiar with the terms like non-renewable? Okay, so these are things that are in the earth or they're somewhere to be found, but they are finite, and even if we keep discovering more of them, they are still finite, and each time we use some of them, there is that much less remaining, right? So every time we bring a barrel of oil, and of course we don't literally bring barrels of oil out of the ground, but every time we bring some oil out of the ground or out of the sea, which is really the ground, but having to come through perhaps thousands of feet of water as well, there is that much less oil left remaining. Every time we bring a ton of coal out of a mine, there is that much less coal, and so forth. And even natural gas, and I'm sure that you've been hearing all sorts of things about the Marcellus and the other formations and how, wow, we have hundreds of years, or at least 100 years supply, and we don't know what to do with all this gas that we have. Of course, there's another side to that story that we're also going to talk about, and that has to do with the fallout from fracking, the hydrogen fractionation that has to take place. The clearly highly polluting and toxic nature of many of these fuels and technologies, okay, I don't think that there's much misunderstanding or doubt about that, unless anybody here is representing the oil industry or gas. Even then, I mean, they kind of know, they just would like us to know how much they're doing about that. But they are, by their nature, polluting and toxicizing. And I would suggest to you, unsustainable. You know, even if we have 100 or 200 or 300 years supply, they're unsustainable for one reason or another. It may be economically unsustainable, it may be technologically unsustainable, it may be socially unsustainable, it may be environmentally unsustainable. So, you know what I mean? Somewhere in that group of possibilities. And I think we all know enough about, for example, global climate change, or acid rain, or smog, or any of the other effects of burning fossil fuels to know that there is an issue of environmental sustainability there. And I'll come back to that point in a few minutes. So here's the new order that might be emerging, might already be upon us. Okay? So we're going to have to see about that. And as you know, you can see it's about renewable, meaning they can keep being regenerated, replaced, regrown, whatever the case may be. We're talking about examples like sun, wind, water, biomass, biofuels, and so forth. Geothermal. Okay, much less. Now notice I'm saying they're not at all polluting or toxic. They're much less polluting or toxic. And for those of us who know about these things, we understand that that's the case. They are therefore much more sustainable environmentally, economically, politically, that's interesting because of the politics of what's up here versus what's down there. All right, we seem to keep getting ourselves into political spheres up here too, by the way. Now, the old order, this is the this is the interesting kind of fly in the ointment, if you will. The old order, the existing order, can and does, if you will, allow some level of the new order to appear and to be part of the energy system, part of the energy scene, without there being a transition. Okay? And in fact, in some ways, it helps them to look pretty good or okay. And the only thing is, when I say they, I'm talking about, you know, the oil companies, the natural gas companies, the companies that make the equipment that go into the making of refineries, that go into the making of nuclear reactors and so forth, right? There's a whole cluster of business firms and organizations and government agencies, by the way. It's not just about business, that are all involved in and committed to these things. So, you know, it kind of helps take the heat off of them, if you will, when, you know, supplies of one fuel or another are getting low, that some of these others can be part of the scene too. And it helps them to look pretty good. Now, there are two challenges. Remember, one of the words that stuck out from that definition of energy transition was challenge. There are two major challenges that we now need to talk about. We've already started to talk about them, so I just want to bring them front and forward. So we're talking about the challenge to energy security and the challenge to environmental sustainability. So the idea of energy security is that we have supplies of energy that are readily available without the threat of major disruption. Without the threat of major disruption, whether it's some kind of war or other kind of disturbance or difficulty in some part of the world, or a disruption involving blackouts or other kinds of things. How many of you remember, for example, the great blackout of electricity that occurred in August of 2003? It's kind of our lifetime, so hopefully you remember that. Some of us go back far enough to remember the one in 1965, which was, we won't acknowledge who we are. I guess I just did. And in a chapter that I co-authored with another person who's pretty knowledgeable about these things, I talked about, you know, the comparison and contrast between those two major blackouts, and I call it the tale of two major blackouts, because they were very similar in how they unfolded, but they were very different in the aftermath. And so it's a very interesting story. At any rate, so security, energy security is one major issue, and challenges to that security are of great concern to us, typically, all right, whether we put it in exactly that term or not. The other being environmental sustainability, so whether we can have supplies of energy that are pretty available without imposing unacceptable environmental costs, environmental kinds of effects on us. And these days, of course, one of the buzz phrases that we use, which I think is a pretty cool one, is carbon footprint, to talk about these things. It sort of captures a lot of our current concerns. But there are other kinds of ways that we look at this. And I have some pictures that I'm going to be showing you along the way. So, you know, I brought my photo album with me. All right, here's the deal, folks. And I don't want to do an exhaustive history by any means, but I'm sort of picking out little pictures or pieces of our history with energy over the past, say, 4 decades or so to talk about these things. So when it comes to the challenges to energy security, in most people's books, it goes back to the energy crises of the 1970s. Notice I say crises, all right? And usually, you know, most of us think of the Arab oil embargo boycott of 1973-74 because that's kind of the most known. But as it turns out, there were a string of energy crises throughout the 1970s. And I'm going to talk with you about some of the other ones as well as that, right? And it involved several major sets of institutions, so oil companies and electric utilities. Okay, so it wasn't all about oil, right? It was about electricity as well. The key thing here was the crisis in their inability to make good on, to deliver on things that we in society at that time would come to expect. Okay? It's as simple as that, things that we come to expect. And we therefore had what might be thought of as a kind of a social contract with the energy producers and the other institutions that provide our energy to us. All right? And that contract included things like this, that they would provide us with cheap, abundant, safe, reliable energy. Okay, that would be their part of the contract. Our job would be to obediently use it, enthusiastically use it, and pay the price. And by the way, back in those days, or at least prior to those days, the price was pretty reasonable. You know, gallon of gasoline was very reasonable. I won't even tell you what it was like because you'll just feel bad. And the cost per kilowatt hour of electricity was also very reasonable. So it was a good deal. But that contract came to be betrayed or to unravel as a result of what was happening, beginning to happen in this period of time. Okay? Here's some examples, of course, and some pictures. Okay, and these are both pictures of the oil shocks that were occurring, primarily in 1973-74, because, you know, people at that time could not deal. I mean, you know, people got like killed, you know, and beat up and stuff like that. And some of us remember the lines. You had to like sit in line and worry, you know, hope that your car didn't run out of gas while you're waiting to fill the tank, you know, and stuff like that. And you might get turned away because they ran out of gas. And then there were times when you could only go on Monday, Wednesday, or Friday, or whatever. And then
even odd.
It was exactly. Yeah. If you had an odd number at the end of your license number, you went one set of days and the other. So it was some of us, yes, we remember that. And then that was crippled. That crippled things enough, and that was coupled with at the end of that decade another set of shocks that was tied to the revolution in Iran. Revolution in Iran. Okay. Something sounds familiar. Hey, now, what many people don't realize is that there was already an energy crisis well underway several years before all that happened. And that was to do with electricity. And without going into long depths of that, it had to do with the fact that the electric utilities were unable to meet peak demand, usually in the summertime, okay, so when it gets really, really hot. And there were a series of blackouts and what came to be known as brownouts, in other words, partial reductions in supply. Some of them were planned and prepared for, others not. So it's kind of nifty when your refrigerator starts to die on you because it hasn't been getting electricity flow to run the way it was designed to run, stuff like that. Anyway, the electric utilities were simply incapable of providing at that time in a number of major cities, the peak power load, as it's called. And one of the reasons for this was that a whole bunch of them had ordered nuclear power plants to be built. And in many cases, in fact, in nearly all cases, these nuclear power plants were running severely behind schedule. Now, once they did get up and running, they had other problems, such as reliability, and they weren't capable of running more than 45–50% of their capacity for quite a while. But just getting to that point, right, we're talking about years and years of delays, and that just simply didn't work out well. So the supply versus the demand was way on that. So that was the origins of the energy crisis of the 1970s. The oil stuff, which we mostly know about, came after that. And then, of course, as I hope you all have heard, if not remembered, in March of 1979, 3 Mile Island, which is still the largest accident. We've had a few we call them near misses or near hits, whichever. George Carlin had a great thing about that. It's not a near miss, it's a near hit. But at any rate, we've had, in fact, several hundred of them, but we only hear about the ones that really go bad. And 3 Mile Island was a partial core meltdown. All right, it didn't go all the way. What's ironic, as some of us know, is that there was a movie playing right around that time, or right before that time, called the China Syndrome, which was, remember that? And they said, what state does 3 Mile Island reside in?
That was Pennsylvania.
That was Pennsylvania. There's a line in the movie, okay, that came out a few months before that. And one of the characters, I think played by Michael Douglas, asks the nuclear engineer played by Jack Lemmon, well, you know, if there is a full meltdown, how large of an area would be affected? And he says, an area the size of Pennsylvania. Woo! Okay, so the long lines here as well, so we'll continue. And just to sort of cap off that decade, we've already talked about these things. So what OPEC and Shah did for our relationship to imported oil, the asset of 3 Mile Island did for our relationship with nuclear power. It was already the case, folks, by the way, several years prior to 3 Mile Island, that there was basically an end to orders for nuclear power plants, just because they were so plagued with problems and so uneconomical at that time. And there's a fascinating story about that. If you're interested, I'd love to talk about that, or I can direct you to written material about it. Now, back then, we only imported, I say only because compared to what came, it was pretty small. We only imported about 30% of the oil that we use every day, okay, during this period of time. It subsequently went up to double that. So by about 2005, we were importing on a daily basis about 60%, up to 20 million barrels of oil that we use every day. Now we've come down a little bit since that time, but it's like somewhere in the 18 to 20 million barrels a day of oil that we use in this country. Okay? Wow. Just write that number out. It takes a lot of thought and deliberation. And, by the way, even though that's come down to 40%, there's a story about that that has to do with domestic production having dramatically risen in the past couple of years. But on the nuclear side of things, we still have 102 nuclear reactors that are operating. Until recently, there was 103, and I think it's going to start declining because they're getting old. I'm getting old, and I know how that feels, okay, but I'm not radioactive. I'm not going to take a whole bunch of people or you know, municipalities with me when I start falling apart. These reactors are another thing, okay? And there is a lot of concern. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Anybody ever heard of that publication? The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Bless you. Became very famous after World War II, you know, in the Manhattan Project and the production of the bomb and all that, because they have this very famous face of a clock on the cover of their publication. And it's always so many minutes to 12, as in midnight. You know, it's a nuclear midnight. And whenever things have gotten really tense or scary or dangerous in terms of our risk of nuclear conflagration or some such thing, that minute hand has gotten very close to 12. Okay, so for example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, during 3 Mile, you know, you got the idea? So it's getting closer. It's about 5 of 12. And they put this on every time, I think it's monthly, every month they put that face of the clock on there. And they're talking these days, because I'm just reading their most recent issue, about the condition of the very aging fleet. Yes, they call them fleet, just like the cars. The fleet of nuclear power plants scattered around the country. And you know, we do have about a half dozen or so within distance of us, and that distance is in terms of the spread of nuclear radioactivity. So, okay. When it comes to environmental sustainability, that's the other side of the issue, challenges to that. This is what Los Angeles looked like in the 1960s. All right. Now, you know, the temptation is to blame that on, you know, like the mountains and the valleys and stuff, like bad mountains and valleys for containing all that stuff and making such a mess, right? No, it was basically vehicle congestion and you know, burning of fossil fuels for vehicles as well as for electric power plants. And it's still not great, but it's gotten a lot better than that on those days. All right. So between transportation and coal burning for electric power. Now, coal burning for electric power today, and I'm sort of jumping ahead for a minute, is the primary culprit when it comes to greenhouse gases. Okay, that's the primary culprit when it comes to that. And burning of fossil fuels for transportation is number 2. So just to give you an idea of the order down. But this is back then still. Anybody recognize who that is? Jimmy Carter. That's President Jimmy Carter. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. First of all, another person along the way by the name of Imagery, who runs a research institute called the Rocky Mountain Institute. Dan, did I get that right? Mm-hmm. Right there. Has written, and he is a physicist, and has written extensively on energy issues. In 1977, he wrote a book that talked about the 2 energy paths. Remember Robert Frost's poem about the two roads, the road not taken? Okay. So it was kind of in that mode. And he called one of those paths the hard energy path, and the other one the soft energy path. The hard energy path was the one made up of large scale, you know, utility size, right? Big plants and systems, so when it comes to electricity, other kinds of major facilities with very large refineries, you know, the big coal mines, the industrial coal mines and that sort of thing. The soft one was much smaller scale, much closer to us in our communities. You know, perfect example would be the rooftop solar panels, or even, you know, neighborhood collectors and panels for an entire neighborhood, that sort of thing. And he believed that they were kind of mutually exclusive, that you couldn't have a hard path and simultaneously have a soft path, or vice versa. They were just so different, such different paths going in such different directions. Triggered a lot of debate, as you can imagine. And even to this day, I think we still, you know, might, I don't think we do, but we might still talk about that. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter donned a cardigan sweater and came before the American people to talk about conserving, you know, cutting back on the thermostat, using less gas in the car and that sort of thing. And he, you know, it was kind of preacherly, kind of fatherly, kind of presidential, you know, all rolled together. Didn't go over real well, but the message did carry. And it was, the idea was to try and get conservation happening more and actually use that to kind of trigger a transition to solar energy and other kinds of technologies like that. So, you know, here's the President of the United States at that time trying to get that to happen. Well, unfortunately, it didn't set well with the oil companies and the big coal companies, even though it did talk about coal, you know, or the nuclear power industry, even though he is a nuclear engineer, okay, and he did say that was cool. You know, what's he going to say? You know, that was his former livelihood. But he was really trying and hoping to push solar. So that kind of fizzled before very long. Now, since that time, there's been promise, and I'm going to show you some things about just how things have changed when it comes to some newer, you know, what we call renewable energy technologies and systems, so that you can see, if you haven't already seen this stuff, where we are these days with solar, with wind, and some of the other kinds of renewable sources. I was going to play a video for you, but I think I'm probably using a lot more time than I should as it is, so I'm going to say that. But you know, recently, and that means like about a month ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the United Nations organization, issued, and this is like close to 200 countries that are involved, including the US. We meet periodically to discuss, well, what's appropriate for us to be doing next with trying to grapple with climate change internationally. There's been efforts to get treaties going. It's not been very successful. There are political reasons for that that are pretty big. But at any rate, coming out a month ago saying, we are 95, I think it was, % sure now that the problems that we're facing with global climate change are human caused. Okay, now there are several tens of thousands of geologists and physicists and biochemists and all sorts of climatologists, people of all those kinds of backgrounds that are involved in working on this together. They have long since achieved consensus, right? That's pretty hard to get 10 people to achieve consensus on much of anything, let alone about 19,000, right? So they have achieved basically universal consensus that global climate change is real. And that's been years ago that they achieved that. And now they're 95% certain that it's human caused. In other words, human activity, burning fossil fuels, and that sort of thing. We have had, as I trust you know, some major catastrophic incidents in recent years involving, if not fossil fuels, nuclear, you know, and that's a kind of a side story, but it's always been kind of right there at the same time. And it's interesting how they want to present themselves these days as the green energy. We'll come back to that. But you all know about the BP Deepwater Horizon that occurred in April of 2010. And just incredible damage. Not the only, and I can't call it a spill. I mean, it was just an eruption. You know, it was a catastrophic blowout. It's not a spill. The spill is like, oops, okay? This was a catastrophic blowout that they just couldn't control for several months, and then finally were able to cap it. And then, of course, in the aftermath of the earthquake and tsunami hitting Japan in March of 2011, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power complex basically melting down. Now, there were 6, counting my fingers there, okay, 6 reactors as part of that complex. Want to know how many of them went through partial, if not full meltdowns? Okay.
All 6 of them.
So, just thought I'd share like a little album of pictures that I've collected just to show you quickly. Here's the BP, Deepwater Horizon exploding, and of course, you know, what was it, 18 people lost their lives in that, and just horrific. That was finally brought under control, but then, you know, again, what was happening thousands of feet underneath was what the real next problem was. And eventually, this is NASA, through satellite imagery, showing the plume as it eventually occurred. Now you can see that, and it really did hit, there's parts of Florida, okay, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, so forth. So just devastating to just an enormous amount of our coastline, devastated those coastal economies. Obviously, you know, in this picture of this pelican, those two, I mean, just, you know, the devastation to wildlife is just unbelievable as well. Here's the Fukushima as it blew, one of the units. Eerily reminiscent of mushroom clouds of the bomb that that same country experienced back in 1945. This time supposedly for civilian purposes and peaceful purposes. And this is what it looked like a little while later. there's just this huge fire and burning of very, very super hot materials, and then eventually the plume. Now by day 10, this is spreading, as you can see, across the Pacific Ocean, so the level of radioactivity in western states of the United States was already apparent. No danger to the public, of course. So, is this LA?
No, you can't even see it. It's 95.
This is in China. Recently, this is in Beijing, China, recently. Okay? So we have a world of places, and it's not that they don't know, but they are having trouble managing their growth in a way that can avoid making, some of the same mistakes that we made. They have a leg up on us. They are really doing amazing things with solar and with wind, and they still have a lot of problems to deal with. You may remember from the Olympics a few years back, how many years ago was that? People couldn't breathe. They couldn't even practice running and other kinds of workouts for the games because it was so bad. So here's our friend Bart Simpson. Are we there yet? Is there a transition? Is it time for a transition? Well, if you look at the number of PV, that stands for photovoltaic, for those of you who may not be familiar with that. In other words, electricity generating solar installations. This yellow line here shows, as we start just from 2000 up to 2012, how amazingly, this is really kind of skyrocketing, the number of installations that have been occurring, and the megawattage, in other words, the electric power that they are capable of producing. A lot of this, by the way, is utility scale. That light blue and the bars there, these are electric utilities doing this. This is not people on their own rooftops. In fact, the people doing it on the rooftops is the residential. That's the dark blue. It's growing, okay, and it's good. And for any of you that are hoping to have a future, a career installing, designing, etc., it's absolutely happening, okay? So your future is secure, it's promising. But this is where it's really happening. This is where it's really doing. Okay, and if you look at the projections going out to 2016, here's where we were in the last slide. Okay, so we're talking about quadrupling or more based on what's projected in the coming few years. That's about another 3 years if those projections are at all accurate. So that's solar. Meanwhile, the price per kilowatt hour, okay, what it actually costs for every unit of electricity that's produced, has been steadily declining. Okay, for utilities, it's expected that certainly by 2020, which is, by the way, only, about another six-ish years away, that they can become pretty cost competitive with other kinds of sources for generating electricity, at least when the utilities do it. Now, it's going to take longer for commercial and even longer still for residential, but that depends on what we count in the costs. Okay, and one of the things that we typically see happen is that the true costs, and as an economist type person, I'm always interested in what are the true costs and what are the opportunity costs, as they're called. And the true cost of the other sources compared to the true cost of solar and other renewable technologies puts them much, much more in even, sort of parity, probably much closer to that. Here's wind. Look at that. Going with the wind, right? It's really taking off. Okay, and again, this is the amount of megawattage, just huge, much bigger than solar. And look at the declining cost of wind. Wind is now, and has been for many years, cost competitive with coal burn electricity, with, natural gas is
different story because we're getting a lot of it now, and that's driving down the cost, or the price, I should say. So that's been a little bit of a different scenario. All right, so we're getting some pushback from the established order. So the natural gas people have this Think About It campaign. How many of you have seen that on TV? Okay. So, you know, natural gas is clean, okay? It's clean. It's nowhere near as dirty, in other words, as the others. So we should be shifting in our cars, at the utilities, and of course they have been shifting the utilities to natural gas at a very rapid rate. So it's the clean energy technology. Okay? Don't worry about solar and wind. Go natural gas. I'm exaggerating. Okay. Nuclear power is clean because, quite simply, it does not emit anything that contributes to global warming. All right, so it's going to help us solve our global climate change problems. All right, look at that. Clean air. Okay? As long as they don't, you know, melt out. Clean air. Look at those kids playing out there. Doesn't that look lovely? The green, I don't know if you've ever seen green cooling towers, but I have. You can all go out and paint them green. All right, here's the problem. We got growth in Marcellus shale that's faster than expected. Not just fast, faster than expected, all right? Just, what was that, 2 days ago, Wall Street Journal. U.S. is overtaking Russia as the largest oil and gas producer. All right, we are now well on our way to being #1 oil-producing country in the world. I mean, that was something we said, wow, those days are gone and behind us. You know, we capped out in 1970 or about. Here's our president taking a tour of, I don't know what exactly he's saying, pipelines. Oh, yes, we need pipelines for all that oil, right? So that's another part of the mix here. And there have been some notorious leaks in some of the pipelines, but the solution to leaky, old, rusted pipelines is to build new ones, right? Okay. I just thought that was just that. But we still are having problems. Of course, we're still vulnerable. To say that we only import 40% of our oil is still to say that we're vulnerable to disruptions and problems in other parts of the world, that sort of thing. Hopefully you've all heard something about some of the problems with hydrogen fractionation, or fracking as it's called, and its effects on water supplies and whatnot in the areas where we're doing it. And then, of course, the legacy of Fukushima. There was supposed to be a renaissance, a second coming, as they actually call it, of nuclear power in this country. That has probably largely been put on hold as of now. But there are still some new plants being constructed. They've already broken ground. There are several others that are in late planning stages. And these things take years, folks. Okay, so we're talking about a very long-term project. But we still have that set of ones that have been around for many years, decades, that are not doing very well. Okay, so, question. Are these signs, what we've been looking at, are these signs of the desperate gasps of a dying energy order, the so-called fossil fuel order, or are they signs of its resilience and renewal? And remember, they're quite capable of allowing a certain level of solar and wind to be part of the mix. Our president has, and he's not the first president or other leader to say this, that we can have and should have a range of types of energy sources and technologies in our energy picture. Okay? And that's something that can happen for many decades to come. Now, I'm going to leave you with this thought, and that is the idea of what's called the cultural pseudomorph. Now, the prefix pseudo, right, meaning false, right? Morph meaning shape, or changing shape. And a guy by the name of Lewis Mumford, who was very influential in my learning as well, wrote a book way back in the 1930s called Technics and Civilization. And this is what he had to say, that when these things happen, rock formations go through a geological pseudomorph. right? Where the rock, the outer structure of the rock doesn't change, but its crystalline structure inside can reach out or change or grow in ways that you can't even tell from the outside that it's happening. And then the question becomes, is this the same rock? Is this the same formation? Or is it something different and changing? Right? So that kind of metamorphosis. So, you know, the question of whether this metamorphosis may be happening, and if it is it creeping into the existing system and structures in ways that will really lead to a transition, right? A transition. Or is it going to instead happen in a way that the existing structure uses it to maintain itself and to renew itself and to stabilize itself? Okay. So I leave you with that question. I don't have the answers. Did you notice I don't have the answers, but I do have some questions. So I'd like to know what your thoughts are, your questions. How are we going time-wise? Oh dear. Not too well.
Okay, so sitting in your economist chair, and you mentioned externalities not in name, but you know the external cost of. So, I guess my question is your opinion that that is an absolutely essential component of making this energy transition? In other words, do we have to count as external costs in the internal costs of the energy use? And is that, I know that numbers are out there, but they're not really, they're being applied maybe in academic papers, but they're not really being applied. So are we going that direction? Is industry headed in that direction at all? And if not, what would it take to get there?
Industry is very, as I'm sure you know, is very conscious of their own costs. And if and as their own costs are affected, they will be very receptive to making whatever changes make sense. If it involves conserving, they'll conserve. If it involves adding some levels of renewables to their energy picture, they will do that. But I think the key thing, and you kind of touched on it, is there has to be a commitment kind of across the board. So government decision makers, business decision makers, and academics, and whoever else is interested in looking at this, have got to begin consistently and systematically looking at the full range of costs. Dan, for those who are not familiar with externalities, we're talking about when these kinds of activities occur, like burning fossil fuels or even creating them, producing them, the idea of the costs that also occur, the consequences basically of these activities, but they're not usually captured and accounted for in the costs of making and doing these things. So to internalize them, right, to bring them into the cost picture is what we're talking about. And there has been a general, I don't know if it's a reluctance, just it doesn't occur. There's a lot of resistance though to it. Obviously, the business firms that are in business to make and produce and sell a lot of these things, it's not in their interest to. But what else is interesting, and I'll be quiet after this because I want to hear who else has questions before we. Some of the same companies are involved. They've gotten involved in all these areas. General Electric was involved in the Manhattan Project, in the creation of the bomb. All right. Even long before that, they were involved in making electric power generating stations and related equipment, and all the substations and the lines and all that stuff that goes into making and transmitting and distributing electricity. So they got involved in the nuclear along the way and got very committed to that. Guess what they're also very heavily invested in now? Well, let me ask the question differently. Who is the world's largest, I think it's still the case, maker of wind power turbines? And they're invested in solar. So, in some ways, they can switch back and forth, but they still have major investments. In fact, they have recently increased their investments in gasoline. They have. Where's the incentive to look at the full picture? I think that's a tough nut to crack.
So it's kind of a critical mass, like a sort of grassroots popular perception that we need to integrate it, probably combined with policy. Because the business, like you said, basically you're saying businesses aren't going to do it on their own. They have to be.
I think some will, some will.
Yeah.
Some will. Yeah. Again, what I'm hoping to, impress on everybody is that this isn't just about business. These are about very powerful commitments and institutions. This is about more than just doing business and making money. This is about governing important parts of our society and our way of life. Big stakes, big stakes. What else? Any other questions? Yeah.
Can enough power be derived from these alternatives in the future to support an industrial revolution like this?
Yeah, where are we with that?
Are we going forward within manufacturing on the scale that it was? Can it sustain it?
Well, the answer to that depends on who you ask and, what time frame and that sort of thing. There have been studies done. I can think of a guy by the name of Buddha. So, we basically have the capability, maybe not right now today, but we're well on our way to that we can really capture enough solar energy.
Really?
As one thing. And we really need not confine ourselves to that, right? Because we have, and one of the things I didn't get to show you was just the incredible growth in wind power that has been happening. Second to gas, natural gas, in terms of generating electricity. The growth of wind is now the second largest source of growth in new energy projects. So there may be some limits to how many wind farms we could put and where we could put them and that sort of thing, but I don't think we're there yet. So there are a number of different areas of things. Conservation, by the way, or what we now call energy efficiency, which sounds a lot better, doesn't it? There are a lot of possibilities there as well. And so much so that Amory Lovins likes us to consider that a source of energy. Energy efficiency is a source of energy. So maybe we're not there yet, but we can be well on our way. But we have to have some kind of way of making a commitment to that. And by the way, again, the major institutions, the government, business, the world of business and so forth, have to kind of come on board.
Sorry.
That's it. We're all right. Anybody else? Well, I want to thank you very much for being here, for listening and asking and thinking, and I wish you all well, and hope you sort of stay with some of these ideas.